The mountain air was sharp, cutting through the late afternoon like a blade. A woman moved beneath the weight of split firewood, her breath visible in the cold, her hands raw. Two small children walked beside her, their faces bearing eyes too aware, too knowing for their 5 years. Then the black limousine slowed. Leather and silence inside. Glass separating worlds. A man in $1,000 suit felt his heart stop, his carefully constructed empire cracking as he stared at the woman he'd erased from his life. And the twins with his steel-gray eyes. Time fractured, and in that single breath, the past he'd buried came roaring back. Before the story unfolds, tell us in the comments where you're reading from and whether you believe powerful men can find their way back from the worst mistakes. If you believe in second chances built on ashes, don't forget to subscribe. Scott Roller had not seen real struggle in nearly 6 years. As the limousine glided smoothly up the winding mountain road towards Summit Horizon Hotel, Scott sat in the back seat, his posture relaxed, his expression carved from marble and ambition. Outside the tinted window, the sprawling city far below slowly disappeared behind peaks and pines. Glass towers, stock tickers, and corporate warfare giving way to forest trails, snow-dusted cliffs, and a silence money couldn't manufacture. This resort had once been a dream he and Kimberly whispered about on their cheap futon. Now he was arriving to close a merger that would double his wealth. At 38 years old, Scott Roller was one of the most formidable tech billionaires on the West Coast. His AI-driven logistics empire operated across continents, optimizing supply chains and infrastructure projects governments couldn't handle alone. His name commanded respect in boardrooms, regulatory hearings, and venture capital circles. Investors straightened when he spoke. Markets shifted on his word. He had built everything from a basement startup. That was the story he told at conferences. Beside him in the limousine sat Regina Alvarez, his companion for the past 3 years. She was immaculate, her legs crossed with designer precision, her silk scarf draped like art, her skin untouched by weather or consequence. Her fingers traced patterns on her phone screen, as if the world beyond the glass were merely scenery, not real life. "So this is your big wilderness escape?" Regina murmured, her tone amused but detached, as though observing an anthropological curiosity rather than a living place. "It's where the merger meeting is," Scott replied evenly. She glanced out the window, noting the rustic lodge buildings, the staff in wool jackets hauling supplies, the guests in practical boots rather than heels. A faint smile played at her lips. Not warmth, but something closer to condescension. "It's very primitive," she said. Scott didn't answer. Inside him, something tightened. Not guilt exactly, more like a pressure he had learned to compartmentalize, to shove down beneath quarterly earnings and strategic acquisitions. He had decided to bring Regina to this particular resort for one reason, to prove to himself that the past was dead, that he had moved beyond the man who once loved a woman his board called a liability. Then the car slowed at the service entrance, and Scott Roller's carefully built world shattered like ice. Scott Roller's penthouse occupied the 42nd floor of the Millennium Tower, a glass monument to ambition that pierced the San Francisco skyline like a shard of ice. From his floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled beneath him, a circuit board of lights and lives he no longer felt connected to. He had purchased the space 4 years ago, right after the Series C funding round that valued his company at $3 billion. The interior designer had called it minimalist luxury. Scott called it exactly what it was: a beautiful prison. The relationship with Regina Alvarez had begun at a charity gala in Beverly Hills, the kind of event where champagne cost more per glass than most people earned in a day. She had approached him with the confidence of someone who understood power as a language, not a destination. Regina came from old money. Her father owned shipping routes across the Pacific. Her mother sat on museum boards and made phone calls that ended political careers. She knew which fork to use, which wines paired with which courses, and more importantly, which version of Scott Roller to present at which function. "You need someone who understands your world," she had told him on their third date, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they left a private screening. "Not I love you, not I want to know you, just a statement of strategic compatibility." And Scott, Exhausted from fighting his board of directors about every decision, weary of defending his instincts against men who measured worth in pedigree and performance metrics, had agreed. Regina was elegant. Regina was appropriate. Regina never asked him about the parts of himself he had buried to become the man investors wanted to fund. Their relationship operated on a schedule. Tuesday dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants where they discussed quarterly projections and merger opportunities. Friday evenings at gallery openings or tech industry parties where Regina laughed at precisely the right moments and remembered every venture capitalist's wife's name. Weekends at her Malibu beach house or his Napa estate, depending on which property better suited whatever networking Scott needed to accomplish. They were photographed together at benefits. They looked perfect in Forbes profiles. They never argued because they never discussed anything that mattered. Sex happened on a similarly efficient timeline, usually late Saturday nights after too much wine, performed with the mechanical precision of people going through motions rather than experiencing connection. Afterward, Regina would retreat to her side of the bed, her sleep mask already in place, her breathing becoming slow and steady within minutes. Scott would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the same hollow ache he felt after closing a deal that should have thrilled him, but instead left him wondering why nothing ever felt like enough. His board loved Regina. His investors adored her family connections. His mother, who had spent 5 years convincing him that Kimberly Rogers was charming but unsuitable for a man of your trajectory, practically glowed whenever Regina entered a room. Even his lawyers approved. Regina had signed a prenuptial agreement without hesitation, treating their potential marriage as the business arrangement it fundamentally was. "You've finally found your equal," his mentor had told him 6 months ago, clapping him on the shoulder at a conference in Davos. Scott had smiled and nodded and felt absolutely nothing. The engagement had happened last Christmas. Not a proposal exactly, more like a mutual agreement reached over breakfast in Aspen. Regina had mentioned that her father was asking questions about timelines. Scott had acknowledged that marriage made sense for both their portfolios. They had selected a ring together from a jeweler in Manhattan. 4 carats, emerald cut, flawless clarity. It sat on her finger like a price tag. Now, as the limousine climbed towards Summit Horizon Hotel, Scott glanced at Regina scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by cold blue light, and realized he couldn't remember the last time they had laughed together. Couldn't remember the last time she had asked him a question that wasn't about logistics or appearances. Couldn't remember the last time he had felt anything in her presence except the distant relief of meeting expectations. The golden cage he had built was magnificent, and it was slowly suffocating him. The business dinner stretched across 3 hours of perfectly grilled salmon, aged whiskey, and negotiations that felt like warfare conducted with cloth napkins. Scott sat at the head of the table in Summit Horizon's private dining room, nodding at appropriate intervals as his merger partners discussed valuation models and regulatory hurdles. Regina held court at the opposite end, charming the CFO's wife with stories about their recent trip to Monaco. Everyone smiled. Everyone performed their roles flawlessly. Scott barely tasted his food. His mind kept circling back to that moment at the service entrance. The split second when the limousine had slowed and his eyes had landed on a woman bent beneath firewood. Her face tilted just enough for recognition to detonate through his chest. Kimberly. Older, thinner. Her hands wrapped in work gloves that couldn't hide the calluses. And the children. God. The children with their matching faces and his gray eyes staring back at him like an accusation made flesh. He had looked away too quickly, his breath catching, and Regina had missed the entire thing. She'd been complaining about the altitude giving her a headache. Scott. The merger partner's voice cut through his thoughts. Your thoughts on the Q2 integration timeline? Aggressive but manageable, Scott replied automatically, the words coming from the businessman he had trained himself to be. We'll need to front-load the infrastructure costs. The conversation moved on. Scott excused himself 20 minutes later, claiming jet lag, and left Regina to finish entertaining their guests. She barely glanced up as he departed, too engaged in a story about Art Basel to notice her fiancé's carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. The hotel concierge was young, eager to please, and responded to a $100 bill with remarkable efficiency. Yes, there were staff cabins about a quarter-mile into the woods, past the main lodge. Yes, some of the seasonal workers lived there with their families. No, guests didn't typically visit that area, but Mr. Roller was certainly welcome to walk wherever he pleased. Scott took a service path that wound through pine trees and darkness, his Italian leather shoes completely wrong for the terrain. The November air bit through his suit jacket. His phone's flashlight illuminated patches of frozen ground and exposed roots. He walked for 15 minutes, his breath forming clouds, his mind screaming that this was insane, that he should turn back, that whatever he found would only make everything worse. Then he saw lamplight through trees. The cabin was smaller than his walk-in closet. Wood frame construction, a stone chimney leaking smoke, windows patched with what looked like plastic sheeting on one corner. A generator hummed somewhere behind the structure. Firewood was stacked against the exterior wall, the same firewood he'd seen Kimberly carrying hours earlier. Scott stopped 30 feet away, suddenly aware of how absurd he looked. A billionaire in a designer suit, hiding in the woods like a stalker, staring at the life his abandoned wife had been forced to build. Through the window he could see movement. Kimberly, her hair pulled back, stirring something on a small stove. The twins, his children, Christ, his actual children, sat at a table barely large enough for two, their heads bent over what might have been homework or drawings. The boy looked up suddenly, saying something Scott couldn't hear. Kimberly smiled, and the expression transformed her face into something Scott remembered from another lifetime. Warmth. Real warmth, not the calculated pleasantness Regina deployed like a weapon. Scott stood in the darkness, watching the family he had destroyed, and felt something inside him begin to break. Kimberly Rogers had stopped expecting rescue approximately 4 years and 7 months ago. That was the morning she'd finally accepted that the lawyers weren't lying, that Scott really had moved on, that the man who once promised her forever had decided she wasn't worth the inconvenience of a phone call. The twins had been 6 months old then, screaming in rotation through the night while Kimberly survived on food bank donations and the mercy of a landlord who let her pay rent 3 weeks late. She had written 17 letters, made 43 phone calls, sent emails that bounced back from blocked addresses. Scott's legal team had been efficient. She'd give them that much. They'd made her disappear so thoroughly she sometimes wondered if their relationship had been real at all. So she'd stopped trying, stopped crying, stopped imagining the moment Scott would realize his mistake and come looking for them. She'd learned to survive instead. The job at Summit Horizon Hotel had come 8 months ago through a referral from another single mother at the twin school. Seasonal work, minimum wage, but it came with staff housing and didn't ask questions about gaps in her employment history. Kimberly hauled firewood, cleaned guest cabins, restocked linens, and did whatever else management needed. Her hands had developed permanent calluses. Her back ached in ways that made her feel 40 instead of 32. But the twins had a roof over their heads and food that didn't come from charity organizations. She had named them Carter and Maya. The boy had Scott's stubborn chin and intensity. The girl had his steel-gray eyes but Kimberly's gentleness. They were 5 years old and already understood that money was tight, that mama worked hard, that wishes didn't always come true. It broke something in Kimberly every time Carter asked why they couldn't have new shoes like the other kids, or when Maya wondered aloud if they'd ever live somewhere warm. This afternoon, she'd been carrying her 3rd load of firewood to the guest fire pits when the black limousine had rolled past. She hadn't thought anything of it initially. Rich people arrived in expensive cars all the time. But then the vehicle had slowed, and through the tinted window, she'd caught a glimpse of a face she'd spent 5 years trying to forget. Scott Roller. Older, harder, wearing a suit that probably cost more than she'd earned all year. Looking directly at her. Their eyes had met for maybe 2 seconds. Long enough for Kimberly's world to tilt sideways. Long enough for every carefully buried emotion to come screaming back to the surface. Then the twins had run up calling for her, and she'd grabbed them instinctively, protectively, as if Scott might somehow steal them through glass and distance. The limousine had continued up the drive. Kimberly had stood there shaking, firewood scattered at her feet, while Carter asked if she was okay. She'd lied and said yes. Now, Hours later, stirring watered-down soup on her hot plate while the twins finished their homework, Kimberly felt the weight of those 2 seconds pressing against her chest like a physical thing. Scott was here, at her hotel, in her world, and she had absolutely no idea what happened next. Regina Alvarez had not built her life on ignorance. She recognized distraction the way predators recognized wounded prey, by scent, by instinct, by the subtle shift in breathing patterns that betrayed vulnerability. Scott had been distracted since they'd arrived at this godforsaken mountain resort. He'd barely touched his salmon at dinner. He'd excused himself early with a transparent lie about jet lag that insulted her intelligence. And when he'd returned to their suite an hour later with mud on his $1,000 shoes and pine needles clinging to his jacket, he'd offered no explanation whatsoever. Regina had said nothing. She'd smiled, asked if his walk had been refreshing, and filed the information away for later examination. The next morning, while Scott attended his merger meetings, Regina did what she did best. She gathered intelligence. The hotel manager was pathetically easy to charm. A compliment about the resort's rustic elegance, a casual question about the staff's dedication to service, and suddenly Regina knew everything she needed to know. The woman from yesterday, the one hauling firewood like some kind of Victorian peasant. Her name was Kimberly Rogers, seasonal worker, lived in staff housing with her twin children, single mother, no husband listed on any employment documents. Regina had initially dismissed the information as irrelevant. Then the manager had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Ms. Rogers had worked at several hotels over the past 5 years, always seasonal positions, always paid in cash when possible. Quite tragic really, the manager had said. A young woman struggling alone with 2 children. Something about the timeline nagged at Regina. 5 years. The twins were 5 years old according to staff gossip. Scott had been with his previous partner. What was her name? Kimberly something, right around that time before they'd broken up and he'd met Regina. It took Regina exactly 40 minutes of strategic searching on her phone to find what she was looking for. An old social media profile, abandoned and outdated, with photos from 7 years ago. Scott Roller with his arm around a woman at some cheap restaurant, both of them laughing like poverty was charming instead of pathetic. The woman's name, Kimberly Rogers. Regina set her phone down carefully, her mind working through implications with the precision of a chess grandmaster. Scott's ex-wife was here, working as manual labor, with twins who were exactly the right age to be his children. And Scott, her Scott, had recognized her yesterday and said absolutely nothing. The rage that flooded through Regina was cold and calculating. Not jealousy. She didn't love Scott enough for jealousy. This was about territory, about investment, about 3 years of positioning herself as the future Mrs. Scott Roller only to discover some ghost from his past might complicate her carefully constructed plans. She opened her laptop and began making calls. First to her father's private investigator. She wanted everything on Kimberly Rogers by tonight. Then to her attorney. She needed to understand exactly what legal claim this woman and her children might have on Scott's fortune. By lunch, Regina had a strategy. By dinner, she'd have ammunition. And by the end of this weekend, she'd make certain that Kimberly Rogers understood exactly where she belonged. In the shadows, silent, and completely irrelevant to Scott Roller's future. Scott found the box by accident while searching his mother's storage unit for old company documents. He'd been looking for the original partnership agreements from his startup days, the ones his lawyers needed for the merger's due diligence process. Instead, wedged behind a filing cabinet in an unmarked cardboard box, he found 17 letters addressed to him in Kimberly's handwriting. Unopened. Every single one. His hands shook as he tore into the first envelope, dated 6 years ago. The paper was cheap, the ink slightly smeared in places as if tears had fallen while she wrote. Scott, I'm pregnant. Twins. I know you're busy with the funding rounds, but please call me. I need to hear your voice. I need to know we're going to be okay. The second letter, 3 weeks later. Your lawyers sent me papers. They say you want nothing to do with me or the babies. Scott, this can't be real. Please tell me this isn't real. Call me. Please just call me. Scott's vision blurred. He ripped open another envelope, then another. watching Kimberly's desperation transform into resignation across months of ignored correspondence. She'd begged. She'd pleaded. She'd asked for nothing except acknowledgement that he still existed, that their life together had meant something. The final letter was dated 4.5 years ago, written in a different hand, steadier, harder. I'm done waiting for you to remember you're human. Carter and Maya deserve better than a father who erased them for profit. Don't contact us. We'll survive without you. We already have. Scott's phone was in his hand before conscious thought. His mother answered on the second ring, her voice bright with false warmth. Darling, how's the resort? Is the merger proceeding smoothly? You kept her letters. Scott's voice came out hollow, scraped raw. All of them. You knew about the twins and you kept her letters. The silence stretched exactly 3 seconds. Then his mother's tone shifted, becoming the steel he recognized from boardroom negotiations. We protected you, Scott. That girl was gonna ruin everything you'd worked for. The lawyers confirmed she was after your money. She was carrying my children. She was a liability. Scott, be reasonable. You were about to close your series of funding. Investors don't back men with messy personal situations. We did what was necessary. Scott hung up. The phone clattered to the concrete floor. Around him, 17 letters lay scattered like evidence at a crime scene, each one proof that he hadn't been betrayed. He'd been the betrayer all along. Scott waited until Kimberly left for her morning shift before approaching the cabin. Through the window, he could see the twins eating breakfast alone. Cereal from a generic box, milk poured carefully to make it last. Carter, the boy, was talking animatedly while Maya, the girl, listened with the patient attention of someone twice her age. He knocked. The sound felt like a detonation. Both children froze. Carter recovered first, sliding off his chair and approaching the door with a wariness that made Scott's chest ache. The boy opened it just wide enough to peer through the gap, his steel-gray eyes Scott's eyes, assessing the stranger on his doorstep with uncomfortable intelligence. We're not supposed to talk to guests, Carter said flatly. I'm not here as a guest. Scott's voice cracked. I need to speak with you and your sister. It's important. Maya appeared behind her brother, smaller, quieter, her hand gripping Carter's shirt. She had Kimberly's gentle features but those same damning gray eyes that marked her as his daughter beyond any doubt. About what? Carter demanded. The boy's stance was protective, defensive, his body angled to shield his sister. 5 years old and already understanding that the world required guardedness. Scott knelt to their eye level, the movement making his expensive suit pull awkwardly. My name is Scott Roller. I knew your mother a long time ago. I think... The words stuck in his throat like broken glass. I think I might be your father. Carter's expression didn't change. No shock, no excitement, just a cold evaluation that reminded Scott uncomfortably of himself during hostile negotiations. Mama said our father didn't want us. The statement landed like a physical blow. Scott forced himself to meet the boy's gaze. Your mother was right. I didn't, but I should have. I was wrong. Why are you here now? Maya's voice was soft but direct, cutting through pretense with the precision of Kimberly's old honesty. Because I saw you yesterday. Because I found letters your mother sent that I never got to read. Because... Scott's voice broke completely. Because I need you to know that not wanting you was the worst mistake I've ever made. Carter crossed his arms, unmoved. Mama says sorry doesn't mean anything without action. Scott recognized his own stubbornness in the set of Carter's jaw, the challenging tilt of his head. He saw Kimberly's kindness in Maya's cautious hope, the way she looked at him like maybe, just maybe, adults could surprise you. You're right, Scott said quietly. So tell me what action looks like. The gala was Regina's masterpiece, a charity event she convinced the hotel to host with 48 hours notice, leveraging her father's connections and Scott's name. Crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, tech industry elite flown in from San Francisco and Seattle. Everyone who mattered was watching when Regina made her move. Kimberly had been assigned to the event as part of the serving staff, her uniform pressed and her hair pulled back severely. Scott had spotted her immediately, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres through crowds of people who looked through her like she was furniture. He'd wanted to go to her, to pull her aside, but Regina had kept him trapped in conversations with investors, her hand possessive on his arm. Then, halfway through the evening, Regina's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade. "Stop that woman. She's stolen my necklace." The room went silent. Security guards materialized from nowhere, surrounding Kimberly near the kitchen entrance. She stood frozen, tray still balanced in her hands, confusion and dawning horror spreading across her face. Regina approached with theatrical devastation, one hand pressed to her bare throat. "My diamond necklace, it was on the vanity in our suite. Now it's gone, and I saw her leaving our floor this afternoon." "I was cleaning your room," Kimberly said quietly. "It's my job. And you saw an opportunity." Regina's voice dripped venom disguised as sorrow. "I understand, you have children to feed, you're desperate. But theft is still theft." The head of security was already reaching for Kimberly's arm when Scott moved. He crossed the ballroom in 6 strides, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "Stop!" Every eye in the room turned to him. Regina's smile was triumphant. She thought he was going to handle this quietly, preserve appearances, let security escort Kimberly away while the party continued. Instead, Scott positioned himself between Kimberly and the guards. "Ms. Rogers didn't steal anything," he said clearly. "And she's not just staff. She's my wife, the mother of my children." The ballroom erupted. Phones appeared, cameras flashing. Regina's face went white, then red, her careful composure cracking like porcelain. "Scott, what are you?" "The necklace is in your jewelry case," Scott continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Top drawer, left side. Exactly where you put it this morning. I know because I watched you do it." He turned to the security chief. "Search the suite if you need to. You'll find Ms. Alvarez was mistaken." Then Scott looked at Kimberly, really looked at her, in front of everyone who'd ever told him she wasn't good enough. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything." Scott called the press conference for the next morning in Summit Horizon's main ballroom. Word had spread overnight. Social media was already ablaze with speculation, hashtags trending, think pieces being drafted about billionaire scandals and hidden families. His PR team had called 17 times. His board had sent an emergency email demanding he issue a statement denying everything. Instead, Scott stood at a podium in front of 30 cameras and told the truth. "6 years ago, I abandoned my pregnant wife because my family and legal team convinced me she was a liability to my business interests. I never saw the letters she sent. I never knew she was trying to reach me. I built an empire while she raised our children alone in poverty." His voice was steady, stripped of the corporate polish he'd spent years perfecting. "I was told I made a strategic decision. The truth is I committed an act of profound cowardice." The reporters erupted with questions. Scott raised his hand for silence. "Effective immediately, I'm terminating my relationship with Morrison and Chase Legal Group for their role in intercepting communications from my wife. I'm stepping down as CEO of Roller Logistics to focus on repairing the damage I've caused to my family. The board will appoint an interim replacement while I determine what my future involvement with the company will be." A reporter shouted about the merger. Another asked about Regina Alvarez. Scott answered the second question. "Ms. Alvarez and I are no longer engaged. Our relationship was a performance, and I'm done performing." He saw Regina in the back of the room, her face a mask of controlled fury. She'd already released her own statement through her publicist, a carefully worded piece about being deceived, about Scott's instability, about dodging a bullet. Her father's lawyers were likely already working on damage control. Scott didn't care. The final question came from a young woman in the front row. "What about Kimberly Rogers? Have you spoken to her?" "She won't take my calls," Scott said simply. "She has every right to refuse. I destroyed her life and I abandoned our children. An apology at a podium doesn't undo that." He paused, his hands gripping the sides of the podium. "But I'm not going anywhere. I'll spend the rest of my life proving I've changed, even if she never forgives me. He left the stage without taking more questions. His phone was already lighting up with messages. Investors panicking, friends confused, his mother furious. Scott silenced all of them and walked out into the mountain air, heading toward the staff cabins. Toward the only thing that had ever been real. Kimberly was splitting firewood behind the cabin when Scott found her. The axe rose and fell with practiced efficiency, her breath forming clouds in the November cold. She didn't look up when his shadow fell across the woodpile, just kept working with the steady rhythm of someone who'd learned that survival meant not stopping. "I saw your press conference," she said finally, the axe biting into another log. "Very dramatic. I meant every word." "Words are easy, Scott." The log split cleanly. She set up another. "You were always good with words. It's the follow-through you struggled with." Scott moved to the woodpile and began loading split logs into his arms. The bark bit through his shirt. He'd left his suit jacket in the hotel room, along with everything else that marked him as the man he'd been pretending to be. "What are you doing?" Kimberly's voice carried a warning edge. "Carrying firewood." He lifted another armful, the weight already making his shoulders burn. "You've been doing this alone for 5 years. I figure it's my turn." "This isn't a gesture, Scott. This is my life. You can't just—" "I know." He met her eyes, his arms full of wood that was nothing compared to the burden she'd carried. "I know this doesn't fix anything. I know stepping down from my company doesn't erase what I did. I know standing at a podium and confessing my failures doesn't give you back the years you spent struggling." Kimberly's grip tightened on the axe handle. "Then why are you here?" "Because I found your letters. Because I met our children and Carter asked me what action looks like." Scott's voice cracked. "Because I'm ready to carry what I should have carried all along, even if it takes the rest of my life. Even if you never forgive me." The axe lowered slowly. Kimberly's eyes were bright with tears and she refused to let fall. "The twins need winter coats. Real ones, not thrift store hand-me-downs. And the cabin's heater doesn't work half the time. And Carter wants to play soccer, but the league costs money we don't have." "Okay," Scott said simply. "That's it? Just okay. You're telling me what action looks like." He shifted the firewood in his arms. "Where do you want this?" Kimberly stared at him for a long moment. This man who'd once been everything and then nothing, now standing in her yard holding wood like an offering. Finally, she pointed toward the cabin. "Inside. Stack it by the stove." "And Scott," her voice softened, just barely, "this doesn't mean I forgive you." "I know," he said, and began the long walk toward earning what he'd thrown away. 3 months later, Scott Roller was still carrying firewood. He'd moved into a modest rental near the twin school, traded his limousine for a reliable SUV, and learned that redemption wasn't a destination but a daily practice. Carter still called him Scott instead of Dad, testing him with the wariness of a child who'd learned that adults disappear. Maya had started holding his hand sometimes, her trust offered in careful increments. Kimberly kept her distance, but she'd stopped flinching when he appeared. They'd established a routine. He picked up the twins twice a week, attended their school events, showed up when he said he would. No grand gestures, no checkbook solutions, just presence, steady and relentless. Some nights, after tucking the twins into their new beds in their new apartment, the one he'd helped Kimberly find, the one with heat that actually worked, Scott would sit in his car and wonder if this quiet, unglamorous life was what he'd been searching for all along. The empire he'd built still existed, but it no longer owned him. The golden cage had been dismantled, piece by piece, until all that remained was a man learning to be human again. And somewhere in the slow accumulation of kept promises and carried burdens, Scott Roller began to understand that the weight of firewood was nothing compared to the weight of love, and that both required strong shoulders and a willing heart. If this story reminded you that second chances must be earned, not bought, leave a comment below. And if you believe that true wealth is measured in presence, not profit, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge what it means to have it all.